March 15th, 44 BC. Julius Caesar was the most powerful man on earth, conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome, commander of legions that stretched from Britain to Egypt. He had defeated every enemy who dared oppose him, but fell to the very men he had pardoned, trusted, and shown mercy. How does a man who conquered the known world fall so completely in a single moment? This is how Julius Caesar destroyed Rome. Not in one afternoon, but through decades of calculated brutality that made that afternoon inevitable. This is the rise of Julius Caesar, the full story they never teach. Part 1. July 100 BC. A boy named Gaius Julius Caesar was born in Rome into a world that was already dying. The Julian clan traced its lineage back centuries, claiming descent from the goddess Venus herself through Aeneas, the legendary Trojan hero who escaped the burning ruins of Troy and came to Italy. The family possessed ancient patrician blood and aristocratic credentials going back to Rome's founding. But by the time Caesar was born, the Julii weren't particularly powerful or wealthy compared to other patrician families. They were respectable members of the aristocracy, but they didn't control massive estates or command the kind of influence that the most powerful families wielded in the Senate. Two political factions dominated Roman politics and fought each other with increasing violence. The Optimates represented aristocratic Senate supremacy and believed that the traditional ruling class should maintain absolute control over the government. They were the old families with ancient lineages, the traditional elite who owned vast estates worked by thousands of slaves, the landed aristocracy who saw themselves as the natural rulers of Rome. Against them stood the populares, a faction of populist reformers who championed the rights of common citizens and used the popular assemblies to bypass the Senate and implement reforms. But this wasn't really about ideology or political philosophy. It was about raw power and who would control the Roman state. Then came the social war of 91 to 88 BC, and it made everything catastrophically worse. Rome's Italian allies, the various peoples and cities throughout the Italian peninsula who had fought alongside Roman legions for generations, who had bled and died to help Rome conquer the Mediterranean, demanded Roman citizenship and equal rights. They had earned it through their service and their sacrifices. The Senate refused. The allies revolted. The war lasted 3 brutal years and killed over 300,000 people before Rome was forced to grant citizenship to avoid total defeat. But the violence had normalized something extremely dangerous in Roman political life: the idea that political disputes could and should end in mass bloodshed. Class warfare intensified throughout this period. Patricians, the hereditary aristocracy who traced their families back to Rome's founding, held most of the wealth and occupied most of the Senate seats. Plebeians, common citizens who made up the vast majority of Rome's population, grew increasingly desperate and angry as economic conditions deteriorated. Political violence became completely routine in the streets of Rome. Rival politicians hired gangs of thugs to intimidate voters at elections and to murder political opponents in broad daylight. The institutions of the Republic still technically functioned. Elections were still held, laws were still passed, the Senate still met, but raw force and the threat of violence increasingly determined political outcomes. Caesar's family stood firmly on the populares side of this conflict. The Julii weren't wealthy enough to join the Optimate elite, and they had made their political allegiances clear through marriage and political alliances. Caesar's aunt Julia had married Gaius Marius, and this connection would define the young Caesar's entire political identity. Marius was the champion of the populares faction, a military genius who had risen from outside the traditional aristocracy to become the most powerful man in Rome. Between 107 and 100 BC, Marius held the consulship 7 times, which was an unprecedented violation of constitutional norms that traditionally limited anyone to holding the office twice in their lifetime. The common people loved Marius because he represented their interests against the Senate aristocracy. The Optimates hated him for the same reason. Marius had done something that would eventually destroy the Republic, though nobody fully understood the consequences at the time. He had completely transformed how the Roman military operated. The traditional Roman army had consisted of property-owning citizen soldiers who owned their own equipment, served in campaigns for a few months or years, and then returned to their farms. It was a citizen militia, and soldiers served Rome because they were defending their own property and their own families. Marius changed everything. He recruited from the landless poor, the unemployed masses flooding into Rome, men who owned nothing and had no economic prospects. He created a professional standing army where soldiers served for extended periods and expected to be paid with land grants from territory conquered in their campaigns. It was brilliant military reform that made the Roman army far more effective and professional. It was also catastrophic for the Republic's political stability. The new system created a fundamental problem that would eventually tear Rome apart. Soldiers in this new professional army owed their loyalty to their general, not to Rome or the Senate or the Republic itself. The general promised them land and wealth from conquest. The general led them in battle and shared the dangers they faced. The general made them rich through plunder and rewarded them with land when their service ended. If the Senate refused to grant veterans the land their general had promised them, the veterans sided with their general against the Senate. Marius had created armies that were loyal to individual commanders rather than to Roman institutions, and this meant that ambitious generals now controlled military forces that could be turned against the state itself. The precedent was set. Generals with loyal armies mattered more than Senate votes or constitutional procedures. The man who would teach Rome and the young Caesar exactly what that precedent meant was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Born in 138 BC into an old patrician family, Sulla represented everything the Optimates stood for. He believed absolutely in Senate supremacy and aristocratic rule, and he despised the Popularis faction and everything it represented. Sulla had served under Marius in the wars against Jugurtha in North Africa and had distinguished himself as a brilliant military commander in his own right. But Marius and Sulla became bitter rivals, each man wanting supreme command and neither willing to defer to the other. In 88 BC, everything changed. The Senate had awarded Sulla command of the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus, a powerful king in Asia Minor who had invaded Roman territory and massacred tens of thousands of Roman citizens. Command of this war meant glory, plunder, and the loyalty of multiple legions. But the Popularis faction, using the popular assemblies, transferred the command from Sulla to Marius. The Senate's decision was overturned by popular vote. Sulla was in southern Italy with his legions preparing to embark for the east when he received the news that his command had been stripped from him. Sulla did something that no Roman general had ever done in the nearly 500-year history of the Republic. He marched his legions on Rome itself. Roman law absolutely forbade any general from crossing into Italy proper with armed forces. It was the most sacred boundary in Roman political life, the protection that kept military force separate from political authority. Sulla ignored that boundary and marched straight to Rome with 6 legions. His own officers were horrified, and most of them abandoned him rather than participate in what they saw as an unthinkable violation of Roman tradition. But the common soldiers followed Sulla because they were loyal to him personally and because he had promised them rewards. Sulla seized the city without significant resistance because nobody had imagined that a Roman general would actually do this. He declared Marius and 12 other Popularis leaders to be public enemies, forcing them to flee Rome or face execution. He pushed through legislation that strengthened the Senate's power and weakened the popular assemblies, cementing his political changes through military force rather than constitutional process. Then, having secured his command and crushed his political enemies, Sulla left for the war in the east against Mithridates. The moment Sulla left Italy, Marius returned with his own supporters and his own armed forces. Marius seized Rome in exactly the same way Sulla had, using military force to override political institutions. What followed was a bloodbath. Marius and his ally Cinna hunted down Sulla's supporters throughout the city and massacred them without trial. Heads were displayed in the forum. Bodies were left in the streets as warnings. The violence was indiscriminate and terrifying, targeting not just Sulla's political allies, but anyone who had opposed Marius or who was wealthy enough to be worth plundering. Marius died in 86 BC during his 7th consulship, but Cinna continued to control Rome with military force until 84 BC. In 83 BC, Sulla returned from the east. He had defeated Mithridates and secured Rome's eastern provinces, and he brought his battle-hardened legions back to Italy. Civil war erupted immediately. Sulla's forces landed in southern Italy and began marching north toward Rome. The Populares faction raised armies to stop him, but Sulla's veterans were more experienced and better led. Battle after battle across the Italian peninsula ended in sullen victories. Thousands of Romans died fighting other Romans. Cities were besieged and sacked. The countryside was devastated. By 82 BC, Sulla had defeated all his opponents and controlled Rome absolutely. Sulla declared himself dictator, which was actually a constitutional office that existed for temporary emergencies. In the old republic, a dictator could be appointed during a crisis and given absolute authority for 6 months to deal with the emergency, after which he was supposed to resign. Sulla declared himself dictator and made it clear he would hold the position as long as he wanted. He held it for 2 years and used those years to completely remake the Roman state according to his vision. The prescriptions began almost immediately, and they demonstrated exactly how power worked in this new Rome. Sulla posted lists throughout the city naming his political enemies. Anyone whose name appeared on the lists could be killed by anyone without any trial or legal process. The killer would receive a reward, and the victim's property would be confiscated by the state or given to Sulla's supporters. The victims included senators, equestrians, wealthy businessmen, and anyone who had supported the Populares faction or who simply owned property that someone wanted. Sulla used his dictatorial power to restructure the Roman government to prevent another populist leader like Marius from ever rising again. He expanded the Senate from 300 to 600 members, flooding it with his own supporters and men loyal to the optimate vision of aristocratic rule. He stripped the tribunes of most of their powers, eliminating their ability to propose legislation or veto Senate decisions. He passed laws strictly limiting how long any general could hold military command in an attempt to prevent another Marius or another Sulla from accumulating too much military power. He restructured the courts, the assemblies, and every other institution of Roman government to strengthen the Senate and weaken popular influence. Then, in 79 BC, Sulla did something that shocked everyone. He resigned the dictatorship voluntarily and retired to his country estate. Sulla had proven that the Republic's constitutional safeguards meant absolutely nothing against determined military force. Julius Caesar was growing up while all of this unfolded around him. He was 12 years old when Sulla marched on Rome in 88 BC. He was 14 when Marius returned and the massacres began. He was 16 when his father died suddenly in 85 BC, probably from natural causes, making young Caesar the head of his family overnight. Responsibility for his mother Aurelia and for the family's political position now rested on a teenage boy who had grown up watching Rome tear itself apart. Caesar had been betrothed to a girl named Cassutia from a wealthy equestrian family, a sensible match that would have brought money into the Julian clan. But Caesar broke off that engagement in favor of a much more politically significant marriage. He married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, who was Marius's closest political ally and had served as consul for 4 consecutive years, while controlling Rome through military force. This marriage was a clear political statement. Caesar was aligning himself completely with the Popularis faction and with his uncle Marius's legacy, even though Marius was dead and the Popularis faction had been crushed by Sulla's return. Then, in 82 BC, with Sulla firmly in control of Rome and the proscriptions underway, Sulla sent Caesar a direct message: divorce Cornelia. It was a test of loyalty and a demand for submission to the new Optimate regime. Sulla was offering Caesar a way to survive. Abandon your Popularis connections, break your ties to Marius's faction, demonstrate that you accept aristocratic rule, and you'll be allowed to live and have a political career under the new order. Caesar refused. An 18-year-old patrician with no power, no army, no political position, and no protection, refused the dictator of Rome. Sulla had murdered thousands of people whose names appeared in his proscription lists. Sulla's supporters were hunting down Popularis sympathizers throughout Italy. Sulla controlled every institution of Roman government and commanded multiple legions of veterans who would kill anyone he ordered them to kill. And Caesar, whose only claim to importance was his connection to Marius through his aunt's marriage, refused Sulla's direct order. Sulla ordered Caesar's arrest. Caesar went into hiding immediately. He spent months as a fugitive in his own city, moving between safe houses, staying with family, friends, and supporters who were willing to risk Sulla's wrath, constantly evading the agents searching for him. For months, he lived knowing that discovery meant death. He was hunted through the streets of Rome like an animal simply because he had refused to divorce his wife and abandon his political principles. Eventually, influential relatives interceded on Caesar's behalf. The Vestal Virgins, whose religious authority was so sacred that even Sulla had to respect it, pleaded for mercy for the young man. Other members of Caesar's family who had made their peace with Sulla argued that this boy posed no threat and that killing him would serve no purpose. Sulla finally relented and allowed Caesar to live. But according to the historical sources, Sulla issued a warning to those who had pleaded for Caesar's life. Have your way and take him, but know that this young man will one day prove the ruin of the party of the nobles. For in this Caesar, I see many Mariuses. Whether Sulla actually said those words, or whether they were invented later by historians who knew how the story ended, the sentiment captured something true. Caesar's political identity had been formed in those months as a hunted fugitive. He had learned that the Republic was already dead, that constitutional rights were meaningless, that legal protections evaporated when faced with military force, and that power came from legions, not from laws. He had learned that Sulla's vision of aristocratic Senate rule was maintained only through proscriptions and terror, and he had learned that he would rather die than submit to that system. Caesar was anti-Sullan to his core, a Popularis loyalist who would spend his entire career working to destroy everything Sulla had built. But he was also learning Sulla's real lesson, the one that mattered more than any political ideology. In the end, military force defeats constitutional authority every single time. Caesar left Rome as soon as it was safe to do so. From 81 to 78 BC, he served in the Roman military in Asia Minor, far from Italy and far from Sulla's watchful eyes. He served under Marcus Minucius Thermus in the province of Asia and distinguished himself enough to earn the civic crown, which was awarded to soldiers who saved a Roman citizen's life in battle. It was a prestigious military honor, and it gave Caesar credentials as a soldier, not just as a politician from an aristocratic family. Sulla died in 78 BC, and Caesar returned to Rome. But he didn't return to seek political office immediately. Instead, he built a reputation through the legal system. He prosecuted corrupt provincial governors, men who had abused their authority and plundered the provinces they were supposed to govern. These prosecutions made Caesar famous because he was fearless in attacking powerful men, and they established him as a talented public speaker and a defender of Roman citizens against aristocratic abuse of power. He lost most of these cases because the juries were packed with senators who protected their own. But losing didn't matter. He had made his name and shown that he wouldn't be intimidated by the aristocracy. In 75 BC, Caesar went to Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy under Apollonius Molon, the same teacher who had trained Cicero. He was building the skills he would need for a political career, learning how to persuade crowds and how to argue cases and how to present himself as a champion of the people. But the lesson he had learned from watching Sulla's career was settling deeper into his mind with every passing year. Rome rewarded violence, not virtue. The Republic's constitutional system had failed to prevent Marius and Sulla from marching on the city with their armies. The Senate had proven itself incapable of solving the economic crisis or the veterans' land crisis or any of the fundamental problems tearing Roman society apart. The aristocracy clung to power through the proscriptions and through control of the courts, but their authority rested ultimately on the legions that had put Sulla in power. Legal procedures and constitutional traditions had been revealed as hollow formulas that collapsed the moment someone with an army decided to ignore them. Caesar was 25 years old. He had survived Sulla's proscriptions. He had military credentials and a growing reputation as a fearless prosecutor of corrupt officials. He had learned that the Republic was already dying and that only military power mattered in the end. Now he needed to acquire that military power himself, and that would take time, careful political maneuvering, massive amounts of money, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. The education of Julius Caesar was complete. Now came the patient, methodical work of building the machine that would destroy the Roman Republic. Part 2. The Alliance. In 69 BC, Caesar held his first significant political office as quaestor, serving in the province of Hispania Ulterior in Spain. It was a junior position in the Roman political hierarchy, responsible for financial administration and assisting the provincial governor. That same year, his wife Cornelia died. They had been married since Caesar was 18, through the years when he had defied Sulla and gone into hiding, through all the political struggles and dangers. Her death removed one of Caesar's last emotional connections to his youth and to the Popularis faction's old guard. In 67 BC, Caesar made a marriage that demonstrated exactly how he approached politics. He married Pompeia, who was the granddaughter of Sulla, the same Sulla who had hunted Caesar and tried to force him to divorce Cornelia, the same Sulla whose political system Caesar despised. This wasn't a romantic marriage. This was pure political calculation. By marrying into Sulla's family, Caesar was building connections with the Optimate aristocracy, even while he continued to position himself as a Popularis champion. He was learning to play both sides, to build alliances wherever they were useful, to put political advantage ahead of personal feelings or factional loyalty. In 65 BC, Caesar was elected curule aedile, one of 4 officials responsible for public works, temples, and most importantly, public games and festivals. The position itself wasn't particularly powerful, but it offered something Caesar understood was crucial: the opportunity to win massive popular support through entertainment. Caesar staged public games on a scale Rome had never seen before. He presented 320 pairs of gladiators fighting in the Forum, an unprecedented number that shocked the aristocracy and thrilled the common people. Gladiatorial games were expensive spectacles, and the number of fighters directly corresponded to how much the sponsor was willing to spend. Caesar was sending a message about his ambition and his willingness to spend whatever it took to win popular acclaim. The cost was staggering. Caesar went into debt to the amount of approximately 1,400 talents, which in modern terms would be tens of millions of dollars. He borrowed from everyone who would lend to him: wealthy senators, equestrian businessmen, foreign kings, anyone with money. His creditors grew increasingly nervous as the debts mounted, but they couldn't move against him because Caesar's popularity with the Roman masses now protected him. If his creditors tried to force repayment or take legal action, Caesar could appeal to the people, and the people loved him for the spectacular entertainment he had provided. The creditors were trapped. They had to keep lending to Caesar and hope he eventually achieved high enough office to pay them back through the plunder and bribes that came with provincial governorships. This was Caesar's strategy crystallizing: popularity through spectacle, financed by debt, protected by the masses, aimed at higher office that would bring wealth and power. It was a dangerous game because if Caesar's political career stalled, the debts would destroy him. But Caesar was betting everything that he could keep climbing the ladder fast enough to stay ahead of his creditors. In 63 BC, Caesar made a move that stunned Rome. He ran for Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion. This was a lifetime position that carried enormous prestige and religious authority. Traditionally, it went to senior senators who had already served as consul, men with decades of political experience and unquestionable status. Caesar was only 37 years old and had never held one of the top offices. He was running against two much more senior candidates who had far better credentials and far more claim to the position. Caesar's approach was simple. He outbid them. He borrowed even more massive sums of money and distributed it to the voters who would elect the Pontifex Maximus. On the morning of the election, Caesar allegedly told his mother Aurelia that he would either return as Pontifex Maximus or he wouldn't return at all. If he lost after spending that much borrowed money, he would have to flee Rome to escape his creditors. He won. At age 37, Caesar secured lifetime religious authority and a position that made him one of the most important figures in Roman public life. He had also accumulated even more crushing debt, but he had secured power that couldn't be taken away from him. That same year, 63 BC, a crisis erupted that could have destroyed Caesar. Lucius Sergius Catilina, known as Catiline, was accused of leading a conspiracy to overthrow the government through violence and political assassinations. Catiline was a ruined aristocrat who had run for consul multiple times and been rejected, and the Senate claimed he was planning to cancel all debts, redistribute property, and murder his political enemies. Caesar was suspected of involvement in the conspiracy because he was known to be friendly with Catiline, and because canceling all debts would have solved Caesar's financial problems immediately. The evidence against Caesar was probably fabricated or exaggerated by his enemies who wanted to destroy him, but the Senate was determined to execute the conspirators without trial. Caesar stood in the Senate and argued passionately against executing Roman citizens without proper legal process. He pointed out that Roman law guaranteed trials and due process even for accused traitors. He argued that the Senate was setting a dangerous precedent by executing citizens based on accusations alone. Marcus Tullius Cicero, who was consul that year and who was leading the prosecution of the conspiracy, ignored Caesar's arguments and had the alleged conspirators executed without trial. Cicero's actions were popular with the Senate aristocracy, who were terrified of another Catiline-style populist uprising, but they were constitutionally questionable at best and completely illegal at worst. Caesar had positioned himself perfectly. He was on record defending legal process and constitutional rights, which made him look like a principled statesman to the people, even while the aristocracy suspected him of being involved in the conspiracy. Whether Caesar had actually been involved didn't matter. He had survived the accusations and emerged with his reputation enhanced rather than damaged. In 62 BC, Caesar was elected praetor, one of the 8 senior magistrates who served as judges and military commanders. That same year, a scandal erupted that forced him to divorce Pompeia. A young aristocrat named Publius Clodius Pulcher had disguised himself as a woman to sneak into the festival of Bona Dea, which was a women-only religious ceremony hosted at Caesar's house in his capacity as Pontifex Maximus. Clodius was allegedly trying to seduce Pompeia. When Clodius was discovered, massive scandal erupted because a man had violated one of Rome's most sacred women's religious rites. Caesar immediately divorced Pompeia, and when asked why he was divorcing her if he didn't believe she had been unfaithful, Caesar supposedly responded that Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. It was a calculated move to protect his own reputation. Caesar couldn't afford to be associated with religious scandal when he held the position of Pontifex Maximus. From 61 to 60 BC, Caesar served as governor of Hispania Ulterior in Spain. This was his first major military command, and he used it exactly as ambitious Roman governors had always used provincial commands, as an opportunity for both military glory and personal enrichment. Caesar waged campaigns against the Lusitanian tribes in the interior of the province, achieving enough military success to earn the loyalty of his troops and enough plunder to significantly reduce his massive debts. He sent reports back to Rome emphasizing his victories, and the Senate voted him a triumph, a ceremonial parade through Rome celebrating military victory, one of the highest honors Rome could bestow. Caesar returned to Rome in 60 BC, wanting both the triumph and election to the consulship for 59 BC. But the Senate, controlled by the Optimates who hated Caesar and feared his growing popularity, set a trap. Roman law required a general celebrating a triumph to wait outside the city with his army until the triumph was held. Roman law also required candidates for consul to register in person inside the city. The Senate scheduled the registration deadline for the consulship election before Caesar's triumph could be held, forcing him to choose. Either stay outside the city and celebrate the triumph but miss the consulship election, or enter the city to register for the consulship but forfeit the triumph. Caesar chose the consulship without hesitation. The triumph was ceremonial prestige. The consulship was real power. He gave up the military parade and registered his candidacy. But he immediately faced a massive problem. The Optimates controlled the Senate and would block everything Caesar tried to do as consul. His legislation would be vetoed, his appointments would be rejected, his initiatives would be strangled. The Senate aristocracy had spent years watching Caesar's rise with growing alarm, and they were determined to make his consulship useless and to prevent him from achieving any real power. Caesar needed allies, and he found them by creating something that would change Roman history, the First Triumvirate. This wasn't an official alliance, it wasn't public, it wasn't constitutional. There was no formal agreement or legal structure. 3 men met in private and agreed to pool their resources, support each other's political goals, and use their combined power to dominate Roman politics. They called nothing, signed nothing, and announced nothing. But between them, they controlled enough wealth, military force, and political influence to override the Senate completely. The first member of this secret alliance was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great. In 60 BC, Pompey was 46 years old and unquestionably Rome's greatest living general. He had conquered the eastern Mediterranean, defeated the pirates who had terrorized Roman shipping for decades, reorganized entire provinces, and accumulated enormous wealth from his campaigns. His military achievements rivaled those of any Roman commander in history. He had earned his cognomen, Magnus the Great, and he demanded the respect and recognition he believed he deserved. But Pompey had a problem. The Senate feared him. His military power was so great that senators worried he would use his armies to make himself dictator, like Sulla had done. The Optimates in particular refused to cooperate with Pompey because they saw him as a threat to aristocratic Senate supremacy. Pompey had 2 specific demands. He wanted the Senate to ratify his political settlements in the eastern territories he had conquered, confirming the arrangements he had made with client kings and local governments. And he wanted land grants for his veterans who had served with him for years and expected to be rewarded with farms. The Senate refused both demands. They stalled, they delayed, they raised procedural objections, and they made it clear they would not give Pompey what he wanted. Pompey was the most powerful general in the Roman world, and the Senate was treating him like a political nobody whose requests could be safely ignored. The second member of the alliance was Marcus Licinius Crassus, who was simply the richest man in Rome. His wealth was estimated at 200 million sesterces, which in modern terms would be billions of dollars. Crassus had made his first fortune during Sulla's proscriptions by purchasing the confiscated property of executed popularis supporters for fractions of its real value. He had expanded that fortune through real estate speculation. He famously kept a private fire brigade that would rush to burning buildings, offer to buy the property at a massive discount while it burned, and then put out the fire if the owner agreed to sell. He owned silver mines, he owned vast estates worked by thousands of slaves, and he loaned money to senators and equestrians who needed capital. He was wealthier than most kingdoms. But Crassus had a problem too. His wealth didn't translate into the respect and political power he craved. The aristocracy looked down on him as someone who had made his money through vulgar commerce and opportunistic speculation during the proscriptions. They took his loans, they borrowed his money, they accepted his financial support, but they didn't respect him as they respected military conquerors like Pompey. Crassus wanted political power and influence that matched his wealth. He also wanted his own military glory to rival Pompey's, which drove many of his later decisions. The third member was Gaius Julius Caesar himself. In 60 BC, Caesar was 40 years old, a rising political star who had served as Pontifex Maximus, praetor, and provincial governor. But he was also politically isolated, carrying massive debts, and facing powerful enemies in the Senate who wanted to destroy him. Caesar wanted the consulship for 59 BC. But more than that, he wanted a major military command afterward that would give him immunity from prosecution, opportunity for military glory, and time to build an army loyal to him personally. His enemies in the Senate would block all of this if they could. What Caesar offered the alliance was the crucial ingredient the other two lacked: political skill and willingness to manipulate the system ruthlessly. Pompey was a brilliant general, but a clumsy politician who didn't understand how to maneuver through Senate procedures and factional politics. Crassus had money, but no political base and no way to translate wealth into votes. Caesar understood exactly how Roman politics worked, how to use the popular assemblies to bypass the Senate, how to build coalitions, and how to turn popular support into political power. He could make this alliance function. The deal was simple. They would pool their resources: Pompey's military prestige and veteran support, Crassus's money, and Caesar's political skill. They would dominate the elections, placing their supporters in key offices. They would pass each other's legislation, using their combined influence to override Senate opposition. Each man would get what he wanted. Pompey would get land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements. Crassus would get political power and favorable legislation for his business interests, and Caesar would get the consulship, followed by a lucrative military command. But Caesar understood something crucial that made this alliance work. It needed a personal bond beyond political convenience. Political alliances in Rome frequently collapsed because the participants had no real loyalty to each other beyond immediate self-interest. Caesar solved this problem brilliantly. He had a daughter named Julia from his marriage to Cornelia. Julia was approximately 23 years old in 60 BC. Caesar arranged for Julia to marry Pompey, who was 47 years old. This wasn't a romantic match. Pompey was old enough to be Julia's father, and he had been married multiple times before. But by all accounts, the marriage worked. Pompey genuinely cared for Julia, and she became the personal connection that held the political alliance together. Pompey was now Caesar's son-in-law. Family bonds in Roman aristocracy were powerful, and Pompey now had a personal investment in Caesar's success that went beyond political calculation. The alliance had been cemented with blood and marriage, making it much stronger than a mere agreement of political convenience. The First Triumvirate, though nobody called it that at the time, now controlled Roman politics. 3 men working in secret, had accumulated enough power to override the Senate and dominate the Republic. The constitutional system still technically functioned, but real power had shifted to this private arrangement between three ambitious men. In 59 BC, Caesar was elected consul for the year. His co-consul was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, an optimate who represented everything the Senate aristocracy stood for and who was determined to oppose everything Caesar tried to do. The Senate had made Bibulus consul specifically to block Caesar, to veto his legislation, and to prevent him from achieving anything during his year in office. They thought they had checkmated Caesar by giving him a hostile co-consul who would paralyze the government. Caesar's response revealed exactly how he intended to approach constitutional obstacles. He would ignore them. When the Senate refused to pass his legislation, Caesar bypassed the Senate completely and took his proposals directly to the popular assemblies. The assemblies, filled with common citizens who loved Caesar for his spectacular games and his promises of land reform, voted enthusiastically for everything he proposed. When Bibulus tried to use his co-consul veto power to block these votes, Caesar had Pompey's veterans show up in the forum to encourage the voting. These were hardened soldiers who had fought for Pompey across the Mediterranean, and their physical presence made it clear that opposition would be met with violence. Bibulus tried to stop one of Caesar's votes by physically interposing himself between Caesar and the assembly. Caesar's supporters grabbed Bibulus, dumped a bucket of excrement over his head, and broke the ceremonial rods that symbolized his authority as consul. Bibulus retreated to his house, humiliated and powerless. He declared that all remaining days of the year were religiously invalid for public business, which should have meant that no legislation could legally be passed for the rest of Caesar's consulship. Caesar ignored this declaration completely. The assemblies kept meeting, legislation kept getting passed, and Bibulus stayed home issuing increasingly hysterical proclamations that everyone ignored. The joke circulating through Rome was that this was the consulship of Julius and Caesar, rather than the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus. Both consuls were named Caesar now because Bibulus didn't matter. It was a mockery of the constitutional system that was supposed to prevent any one person from dominating the government through the checks and balances provided by having two equal consuls. Caesar had made those checks and balances irrelevant through simple willingness to use force and ignore constitutional procedures. The legislation Caesar pushed through gave each member of the triumvirate what he wanted. Land distribution laws granted Pompey's veterans the farms they had been promised, finally rewarding them for their years of military service. Pompey's political settlements in the eastern provinces were ratified, confirming his arrangements and his authority. Tax legislation favorable to Crassus's publicani, the private tax collectors who made fortunes collecting provincial revenues, was passed, enriching Crassus and his business associates. And Caesar secured what he needed most, a 5-year proconsular command in Gaul. The provinces of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum were assigned to Caesar with 4 legions under his command. This was an extraordinary military command that gave Caesar control over a massive territory, a substantial army, and years to build his power far from Senate oversight. Caesar also made one more strategic marriage during his consulship. He married Calpurnia, the daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, who was an influential senator with connections throughout the aristocracy. This marriage brought Caesar more political allies and more protection against his enemies in the Senate. The 5-year command in Gaul was everything Caesar needed. Military command meant immunity from prosecution. Roman law protected provincial governors from legal action while they held office, which meant Caesar's enemies couldn't drag him into court on charges related to his consulship or his debts or anything else for at least 5 years. Gaul meant opportunity for conquest, for military glory that would rival Pompey's achievements, and for massive wealth from plunder and slaves and territorial expansion. 5 years meant time to build an army of veterans who would be loyal to Caesar personally, who would owe their land grants and their prosperity to Caesar. and who would follow Caesar's orders rather than the Senate's. The command was later extended to 10 years in 55 BC, giving Caesar even more time to build his power base. In March 58 BC, Caesar left Rome for Gaul. Behind him, he left a city where the constitutional system had been openly mocked and overridden, where the Senate's authority had been shown to be meaningless against determined military force and popular support, and where 3 men controlled Roman politics through a secret arrangement that the traditional institutions couldn't counter. Ahead of him lay Gaul, a vast territory filled with wealthy tribes to conquer and enemies to defeat. The plan was now set. Caesar would spend the next decade in Gaul building military power that would eventually rival Pompey's. He would transform 4 legions into 10, create an army of battle-hardened veterans absolutely loyal to him, accumulate wealth that would eliminate his debts and make him one of the richest men in Rome, and achieve military glory that would make his name legendary throughout the Roman world. Caesar had watched Sulla march on Rome with his legions in 88 BC when Caesar was 12 years old. He had hidden from Sulla's agents when Caesar was 18. He had seen the proscription lists posted throughout Rome, naming thousands of citizens who could be murdered without trial. He had watched as Sulla used military force to override every constitutional protection, to restructure the government, and to impose his will on the Republic through sheer armed power. He had learned the fundamental lesson that the Roman Republic was teaching ambitious men in this era. Armies beat constitutions, legions trump laws, and military force is the only real power that matters. The Gallic command wasn't about defending Rome from barbarian threats. The tribes of Gaul weren't actually threatening Roman territory when Caesar arrived. The command was about creating the military force Caesar would eventually need. It was about building an army that owed its loyalty to Caesar alone, that would follow Caesar's orders even if those orders contradicted the Senate's authority, and that would be strong enough to challenge Pompey's legions if it came to that. Caesar had 5 years initially, extended to 10, to build this machine. 10 years to turn administrative provinces into a conquered empire. 10 years to transform ordinary legions into veteran forces that had fought together through countless battles. 10 years to make his name so famous and his achievements so legendary that the Roman people would support him against the Senate. 10 years to accumulate the wealth and the glory and the military power he would need to finish what Sulla had started, because Caesar understood what many of his contemporaries still refused to accept. The Republic was already dead. Marius and Sulla had killed it with their civil wars and their proscriptions. The constitutional system no longer worked when generals commanded armies loyal to them personally rather than to Rome. The checks and balances had failed when Pompey and Crassus and Caesar could pool their resources and override the Senate completely. The institutions still existed, the offices still had their traditional names, the elections still happened on schedule, but real power had shifted to whoever controlled the most legions. If the Republic was already a corpse, then Caesar would bury it and build something new. But first, he needed an army, and Gaul would give him that army. Part 3. Caesar arrived in Gaul in 58 BC with 4 legions and a clear understanding of what he needed to accomplish. He needed military glory that would rival Pompey's legendary conquests in the East. He needed massive wealth to pay off his debts and finance his political ambitions. He needed battle-hardened legions that would be loyal to him personally rather than to the Senate or to Rome. And he needed to maintain his proconsular command long enough that his enemies couldn't prosecute him the moment he returned to private citizen status. The method was simple: constant warfare. Gaul in 58 BC consisted of dozens of independent tribes with no unified opposition to Roman expansion. The tribes fought each other as often as they fought external enemies, and their political organizations were fragmented and localized. Caesar's approach was to provoke conflicts, claim defensive necessity when tribes responded to Roman provocations, and then conquer everything in sight. Each war would lead to the next. each conquest would justify further expansion, and Rome would believe Caesar was defending Roman interests rather than pursuing wars of naked aggression for his personal gain. Caesar understood the power of narrative control. He sent detailed reports back to Rome describing his campaigns, reports that were eventually published as the Commentari de Bello Gallico, Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. The commentaries were a propaganda masterpiece written in clear, straightforward Latin that presented Caesar as a reluctant warrior forced to defend Rome against barbarian threats. The Helvetii tribe in 58 BC provided Caesar's first opportunity. Approximately 368,000 Helvetii attempted to migrate from their territory in modern Switzerland westward through Gaul and into Roman-controlled territory. Caesar claimed this mass migration represented a threat to Rome and that he had to stop it for defensive reasons. The claim was dubious at best. The Helvetii were migrating, not invading, and they had no apparent hostile intentions toward Rome. But Caesar attacked anyway, destroying the Helvetii migration at the Battle of Bibracte. Casualties were estimated at 238,000 Helvetii killed or forced back to their original territory. That same year, Caesar turned his attention to Ariovistus, a Germanic king who had crossed the Rhine and was threatening Gallic tribes allied with Rome. Caesar defeated Ariovistus's forces and drove them back across the Rhine. The pattern was established: find a threat, real or manufactured, destroy it completely, and expand Roman territory in the process. In 57 BC, the northern Gallic tribes, known collectively as the Belgae, formed a coalition to resist Roman expansion into their territories. These tribes had watched Caesar destroy the Helvetii and recognized that Rome represented an existential threat to their independence. At the Battle of the Sabis River, the Romans came closer to defeat than Caesar would ever publicly admit. The Belgae launched a surprise attack that nearly shattered Caesar's legions, and only Caesar's personal intervention rallying his troops prevented complete disaster. The Nervii tribe lost approximately 60,000 warriors in the battle, and the entire Belgian region fell under Roman control. The following year, 56 BC, Caesar turned to the Atlantic coast and waged naval warfare against the Veneti tribe in what is now Brittany. The Veneti were skilled sailors whose ships were designed for the rough Atlantic waters, and initially they had significant advantages over the Roman fleet. Caesar built his own fleet specifically to counter the Veneti ships, destroy their naval power, and then executed the entire Veneti leadership as a warning to other coastal tribes about the price of resistance. In 55 BC, Caesar demonstrated Roman engineering capability and military reach by building a bridge across the Rhine River in just 10 days. It was an engineering marvel that allowed Roman legions to cross into Germanic territory for the first time in history. Caesar marched his legions across the Rhine to demonstrate to the Germanic tribes that Rome could reach anyone, anywhere, regardless of natural barriers. After 18 days of operations in Germanic territory, Caesar dismantled the bridge and withdrew back to Gaul. The message had been sent: no river, no mountain, no distance would protect Rome's enemies if Rome decided to attack. That same year, Caesar launched his first expedition to Britain. This was reconnaissance more than conquest. Caesar took 2 legions across the English Channel, encountered significant British resistance, achieved limited military success, and withdrew before winter made the crossing back to Gaul too dangerous. In 54 BC, Caesar returned to Britain with a much larger force of 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. He defeated the British king Cassivellaunus in battle, extracted tribute payments, and declared victory before returning to Gaul. Britain would not be fully conquered for another century, but Caesar had achieved what no Roman commander before him had done. He had taken Roman legions across the ocean to an island that most Romans believed barely existed. That same year, 54 BC, brought the first major crack in Caesar's political foundation back in Rome. His daughter Julia who was married to Pompey, died in childbirth. The personal bond that had held the first triumvirate together was severed. Pompey had genuinely cared for Julia, and her death removed the family connection that had kept Pompey invested in Caesar's success. The political alliance continued, but the personal loyalty was gone. In 53 BC, serious rebellion erupted in Gaul. Ambiorix, the chieftain of the Eberone tribe, led a revolt that resulted in one of Caesar's worst defeats. 15 cohorts of the 14th Legion, approximately 5,400 men, were massacred in an ambush. Caesar's revenge was systematic and brutal. He hunted the Eburones across their territory, killing warriors and civilians alike, destroying their settlements, and effectively exterminating the tribe as a political entity. The message was clear. Successful resistance to Rome would result in complete annihilation. That same year brought worse news from the east. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate, had finally gotten his wish for military glory through a campaign against the Parthian Empire in what is now Iraq and Iran. At the Battle of Carrhae, the Parthians destroyed Crassus's army. 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, another 10,000 were captured, and Crassus himself was killed. The triumvirate that had dominated Roman politics for nearly a decade was now reduced to just two men, Caesar and Pompey. The balance that had kept their alliance stable was destroyed. Caesar in Gaul with his legions and Pompey in Rome with his political power were now on a collision course that would end in civil war. The most dangerous moment of the Gallic Wars came in 52 BC, when Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverni tribe, succeeded in doing what no Gallic leader had managed before. He united the tribes into a coordinated resistance against Rome. Vercingetorix understood that the Gallic tribes couldn't defeat Caesar's legions in open battle, so he implemented scorched earth tactics, destroying food supplies and settlements to deny Caesar's army the resources they needed. At the Battle of Gergovia, Caesar suffered a genuine defeat with 700 Roman casualties and was forced to retreat. It was one of the few times in his career that Caesar had to withdraw from a battlefield, but Caesar's response demonstrated why he was such a dangerous enemy. At Alesia, Vercingetorix made the strategic mistake of allowing himself to be trapped in a hilltop fortress with approximately 80,000 warriors. Caesar built a double line of fortifications around Alesia, an inner wall 11 miles long facing the fortress to contain Vercingetorix's forces, and an outer wall 14 miles long facing outward to defend against relief forces. When a Gallic relief army of approximately 250,000 warriors arrived to rescue Vercingetorix, the Romans found themselves besieged while they were besieging the fortress. Caesar's legions had to fight off 3 major assaults from the relief army while simultaneously preventing Vercingetorix from breaking out. The defensive works held. The relief force was broken and fled. Vercingetorix, with his warriors starving and no hope of rescue, surrendered. He would spend the next 6 years imprisoned in Rome before being paraded through the streets in Caesar's triumph and then executed. The final resistance was crushed in 51 BC at Uxellodunum, where Caesar ordered that all the defenders who survived the siege have their hands cut off. They were released to wander Gaul as living warnings of what happened to tribes that resisted Rome. Gaul was pacified through terror. 8 years of warfare from 58 to 50 BC had transformed Gaul completely. Caesar had conquered territory that would become modern France, Belgium, parts of the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Western Germany. The human cost was staggering, even by ancient standards. Modern historians estimate that approximately 1 million Gauls were killed in the campaigns, and another 1 million were enslaved. Entire tribes were destroyed or displaced. Roman losses were estimated at 30,000 to 50,000 over the 8 years. Significant, but a fraction of the Gallic casualties. The wealth generated was incalculable in modern terms. Hundreds of thousands of slaves were sold in Roman markets. Gold and silver were plundered from Gallic settlements and temples. Land was confiscated throughout the conquered territories. Caesar, who had entered Gaul drowning in debt, emerged as one of the wealthiest men in the Roman world. He had started with 4 legions and ended with more than 10 legions, totaling approximately 50,000 to 60,000 battle-hardened veterans. These soldiers weren't loyal to the Senate or to Rome. They were loyal to Caesar personally because Caesar had led them to victory after victory, had enriched them with plunder, and would provide them with land grants when their service ended. Caesar now controlled a military force capable of conquering Italy itself if he chose to march south. Back in Rome, Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War were being read throughout the city. His propaganda worked brilliantly. Romans believed Caesar was the greatest general since Scipio Africanus, the defender who had conquered vast territories to protect Rome from barbarian threats. The reality was that Caesar had created a personal army for the purpose of overthrowing the government, but the Roman people saw only the hero who had expanded Roman power into territories that had never before been touched by Roman authority. While Caesar was building his military machine in Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating rapidly. In 52 BC, street violence reached such intensity that the Senate House was burned during riots. Pompey was made sole consul, which was completely unconstitutional. Rome always had 2 consuls to prevent any one person from dominating the government. Pompey was also given troops in Italy, which violated the fundamental principle that military forces had to stay outside the city. Pompey remarried after Julia's death, choosing Cornelia, who was the daughter of Metellus Scipio, a leading member of the Optimate faction. The shift was complete. Pompey had aligned himself with the Senate aristocracy and against Caesar. Caesar's proconsular command would expire on March 1st, 49 BC. The clock was ticking. When his command ended, Caesar would become a private citizen who could be prosecuted by his enemies. The Senate was already preparing charges. Caesar's only options were to secure another consulship that would maintain his immunity, or to march his legions south and take by force what the Senate would never grant him peacefully. The machine he had built in Gaul was ready. The question was whether he would use it. Part 4. By 50 BC, Caesar had become the most powerful general in Rome. He commanded more than 10 battle-hardened legions, controlled territory stretching from the Rhine to the Atlantic, and had accumulated wealth that rivaled the richest men in the Republic. The common citizens adored him for his military victories and his promises of reform. But all of that power meant nothing if the Senate succeeded in destroying him legally, and they were preparing to do exactly that. The legal problem was straightforward and deadly. Caesar's proconsular command would expire on March 1st, 49 BC. The moment his command ended, he would become a private citizen with no official position and no legal immunity. Private citizens could be prosecuted in Roman courts, and Caesar's enemies had been preparing charges for years. Cato the Younger, who had become Caesar's most implacable opponent, led a faction in the Senate that was determined to bring Caesar down through the legal system. They had compiled charges of illegal conduct during his 59 BC consulship, when he had used violence and intimidation to pass legislation, unlawful wars in Gaul that had been started without proper Senate authorization, and multiple constitutional violations throughout his career. If these charges went to trial, the outcome was certain because the courts were controlled by the same aristocracy that hated Caesar. Prosecution meant exile at minimum, possibly execution, and certainly confiscation of all his property. It meant complete political death. Caesar proposed a solution that would have avoided civil war. He offered to run for consul in absentia, meaning he would campaign for the consulship while remaining with his army in Gaul. If he became consul before his proconsular command expired, his immunity would continue seamlessly from one office to the next. He would never exist as a vulnerable private citizen. The Senate's response was immediate and absolute: illegal, unconstitutional, refused. They insisted Caesar must give up his command, return to Rome as a private citizen, and only then could he run for consul. They knew this sequence would leave him exposed to prosecution during the gap between offices. The negotiations in December 50 BC and January 49 BC revealed that neither side was willing to compromise. Tribune Curio proposed that both Caesar and Pompey lay down their commands simultaneously, which would have eliminated the military threat from both men and restored something like normal politics. The Senate voted 370 to 22 in favor of this proposal, which showed that the vast majority of senators wanted to avoid civil war and saw the sense in neutralizing both potential military threats equally. But Consul Marcellus ignored the vote completely. He handed Pompey a sword and told him to defend the Republic against Caesar, giving Pompey military authority while demanding that Caesar surrender his. Caesar made a final offer through Mark Antony and Cassius, both of whom were tribunes and therefore supposedly sacrosanct representatives of the people's interests. Mark Antony and Cassius fled Rome when it became clear the Senate was preparing to harm them despite their tribune status. The violation of tribune sacrosanctity gave Caesar the legal justification he needed. He could claim he was defending the people's representatives and the people's rights against an aristocratic Senate that was violating constitutional protections. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, which was essentially martial law that authorized the consuls to do whatever was necessary to defend the state. Pompey was given formal command to defend the Republic against Caesar. Caesar was declared a public enemy of Rome. On January 10th, 49 BC, Caesar stood at Ravenna with only the 13th Legion immediately present. His other legions were still marching south from their winter quarters in Gaul. Caesar faced a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of the Roman Republic itself. Crossing the Rubicon with his legion meant treason, civil war, and fighting against Rome itself. Not crossing meant accepting political destruction, exile, and possibly execution. Caesar assessed the military situation with the same cold calculation he had applied to every campaign in Gaul. The Senate wouldn't negotiate in good faith. They had refused every compromise and made clear they wanted his complete destruction. Pompey's forces were scattered across the empire with legions in Spain, raw recruits still training in Italy, and Pompey himself without an army immediately at hand. Pompey had underestimated Caesar's willingness to act decisively and hadn't consolidated his military power. Caesar had a crucial timeline advantage. If he struck immediately before Pompey could gather his forces, he could conquer Italy before serious resistance could be organized. His veteran legions marching from Gaul would follow wherever he led them, because they were loyal to Caesar personally and trusted him to provide the land grants and rewards they expected. Caesar made his decision. On the night of January 10th or 11th, 49 BC, the 13th Legion crossed the Rubicon River into Italy. Caesar sent a message to Rome saying he was still willing to negotiate and that he was acting to defend the people's tribunes and constitutional rights. Pompey's response revealed how completely he had misjudged the situation. He abandoned Rome and fled south with the Senate loyalists, hoping to buy time to raise armies and consolidate his position. Caesar's strategy combined speed with a policy he called Clementia Caesaris, Caesar's mercy. Every city his legions approached faced a choice: surrender without resistance or face siege. When Caesar's forces captured Pompeian soldiers, he released them rather than killing them. Cities that surrendered faced no punishment, no pillaging, no massacres. Pompeian officers were pardoned and invited to join Caesar's forces. The message was carefully crafted: I am not Sulla, I will not prescribe. The result was exactly what Caesar wanted. Cities opened their gates without fighting. Pompeian forces either surrendered or retreated ahead of Caesar's advance. In 60 days, Caesar controlled the entire Italian peninsula. Pompey evacuated to Greece along with the Senate loyalists and what legions he had managed to gather, conceding Italy without a major battle. Caesar entered Rome briefly, where he encountered resistance from a tribune who tried to prevent him from seizing the state treasury. Caesar's response revealed his true position. Arms and laws do not flourish together. He took the treasury funds he needed to finance his war. The Senate appointed him dictator, which was a constitutional position for emergencies, giving Caesar's rule at least the appearance of legality. Caesar's strategic thinking was superior to Pompey's throughout the Civil War. Rather than immediately pursuing Pompey to Greece, where Pompey was building his strength, Caesar turned west to Spain. The logic was sound. Pompey commanded veteran legions in Spain under his lieutenants, and those legions represented a threat to Caesar's control of the western Mediterranean. Caesar needed to eliminate those forces before facing Pompey directly. The siege of Massilia took 6 months as the city resisted Caesar's forces. In the Ilerda campaign in Spain, Caesar defeated the Pompeian armies commanded by Afranius and Petreius, securing Spain with minimal casualties through maneuver and negotiation rather than through bloody battles. Caesar returned to Rome, resigned his dictatorship after holding it for only 11 days, and was elected consul for 48 BC. In January 48 BC, he finally crossed to Greece to face Pompey in the decisive confrontation. The Battle of Dyrrhachium in 48 BC nearly ended Caesar's career. His army was undersupplied and outnumbered, while Pompey held strong fortifications with secure supply lines from his naval superiority. Caesar attempted to besiege Pompey's position, but Pompey's forces broke through Caesar's siege lines. Caesar suffered approximately 1,000 casualties and was forced to retreat. It was a genuine defeat, and if Pompey had pursued aggressively, he might have destroyed Caesar's army entirely. Instead, Pompey failed to follow up his advantage, and Caesar was able to withdraw his forces into Thessaly and regroup. The decisive battle came at Pharsalus on August 9, 48 BC, on the plains of Thessaly. Pompey commanded approximately 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry, most of them veterans from his eastern campaigns. Caesar had roughly 22,000 infantry and 1,000 cavalry, veterans from the Gallic Wars. Pompey outnumbered Caesar 2-1, and his plan was sound. Use his superior cavalry to crush Caesar's right flank, and then roll up the entire Roman line from the side. Caesar anticipated this exactly and positioned a hidden fourth line of infantry specifically to counter the cavalry charge. When Pompey's cavalry charged Caesar's right flank, Caesar's fourth line emerged and attacked the cavalry with javelins and swords, fighting them as infantry rather than trying to match cavalry with cavalry. Pompey's cavalry routed and fled the battlefield. Caesar's cavalry pursued them and then circled behind Pompey's infantry lines. Pompey's infantry found themselves surrounded, attacked from the front by Caesar's main force and from behind by Caesar's cavalry. Pompey fled the battlefield while his army was still fighting. The Pompeian forces disintegrated once their commander abandoned them. Casualties were approximately 15,000 Pompeians killed and 24,000 captured. Caesar lost only 200 men. The Senate forces were shattered, and Caesar pursued Pompey to Egypt to finish the war. Caesar arrived in Egypt on September 28, 48 BC, only to discover that Pompey had been murdered on the beach by advisors to Ptolemy XIII, who hoped that delivering Pompey's head would win Caesar's favor. Caesar was shown Pompey's severed head and signet ring. His response was allegedly to weep, though whether this was genuine grief for his former ally and son-in-law or political theater is impossible to know. Egypt was embroiled in civil war between the teenage Ptolemy XIII and his older sister wife, Cleopatra VII, who was approximately 21 years old. Caesar intervened and backed Cleopatra, which led to the Alexandrian War that lasted from 48 to 47 BC. Street fighting raged through Alexandria, and at one point, fire spread to warehouses near the famous Library of Alexandria, causing partial destruction of the library's collections. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile River while fleeing Caesar's forces. Caesar emerged victorious and installed Cleopatra as pharaoh with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV as co-ruler, though everyone understood Cleopatra held the real power with Caesar's backing. The relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra was both political and personal. Politically, Caesar secured wealthy Egypt as a reliable Roman ally and source of grain and gold. Personally, Caesar, who was 52 years old, and Cleopatra became lovers. On June 23, 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son she named Caesarion, Ptolemy, 15th Caesar. Caesar acknowledged paternity, though under Roman law he could not make Caesarion his legal heir, since the boy was born outside of a Roman marriage. The relationship secured Caesar's control over Egypt and gave him a powerful ally in the eastern Mediterranean, but it also created complications that would haunt Roman politics for decades to come. Part 5. The Civil War wasn't finished with Pompey's death in Egypt. Pompeian remnants continued to resist across the empire, and Caesar spent the next 3 years hunting down the last opposition to his rule. In 47 BC, while Caesar was still in Egypt with Cleopatra, Pharnaces II, the king of Pontus and son of the legendary Mithridates who had fought Rome for decades, invaded Roman territory in Asia Minor. Pharnaces saw the Roman Civil War as an opportunity to reclaim his father's lost kingdom, while Rome was distracted fighting itself. Caesar marched from Egypt to Pontus and crushed Pharnaces in a 5-day campaign at the Battle of Zela. The victory was so swift and so complete that Caesar sent his famous report back to the Senate consisting of just 3 words: Veni, Vidi, Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. Those 3 words perfectly captured Caesar's approach to military problems. Identify the threat, march directly to it, destroy it completely, move on to the next problem. In 46 BC, Caesar turned his attention to North Africa, where Pompeian forces had regrouped and allied with King Juba of Numidia. At the Battle of Thapsus in modern Tunisia, Caesar's legions crushed the combined Pompeian and Numidian forces, killing approximately 10,000 enemy soldiers. Among the Pompeian leaders who had fled to Africa was Cato the Younger, Caesar's greatest ideological enemy and the most principled defender of the old republic. Cato was in the nearby city of Utica when news of the defeat reached him. Rather than accept Caesar's mercy and live under Caesar's rule, Cato committed suicide. He reportedly tried to kill himself with his sword, botched the attempt, and was found by servants who bandaged his wounds, then tore the bandages off and pulled out his own intestines to finish the job. The final battle came in 45 BC at Munda in Spain, where Pompey's sons Gnaeus and Sextus had raised new armies and continued the resistance. The Battle of Munda was the hardest fight of Caesar's entire military career. His forces nearly broke under the Pompeian assault, and at one point, Caesar personally grabbed a shield and entered the front lines to rally his troops and prevent a complete rout. The battle finally turned in Caesar's favor, and when it was over, approximately 30,000 Pompeians lay dead on the field. Gnaeus Pompey was killed in the aftermath, though Sextus escaped and would continue guerrilla resistance for years. But with Munda, the civil war was effectively over. Caesar had defeated every army that opposed him and eliminated every rival who challenged his authority. Caesar returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He celebrated multiple triumphs for his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. Vercingetorix, who had been imprisoned in Rome for 6 years since surrendering at Alesia, was paraded through the streets in chains during the Gallic triumph and then executed by strangulation in the traditional manner for defeated enemy leaders. The triumph celebrations created political controversy because Romans were deeply uncomfortable with celebrating victories over fellow Romans. Caesar technically celebrated only his foreign victories and made no mention of defeating Pompey or the Senate forces, but everyone in Rome understood what these triumphs really commemorated. This was Caesar celebrating his defeat of Pompey, the Senate, and the Republic itself. Caesar accumulated constitutional positions and honors on a scale that made a mockery of the Republic's system of checks and balances. In February 44 BC, he was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, which eliminated even the pretense that his power was temporary. He held the consulship multiple times. He remained Pontifex Maximus, the position he had secured back in 63 BC, giving him lifetime religious authority. The Senate granted him tribune powers, making him sacrosanct and giving him veto authority over any legislation. He received censor powers, which gave him control over Senate membership and the ability to appoint whoever he wanted to the Senate. He held the title of Imperator, granting him permanent military authority. He was named Pater Patriae, Father of the Fatherland. The honors extended beyond official positions. The month of Quintilis was renamed Julius in his honor, which is why we still call it July more than 2,000 years later. Statues of Caesar were erected throughout Rome. His image appeared on Roman coins, which was unprecedented for a living Roman. Traditionally, only dead heroes and gods appeared on coinage. He was given a golden chair in the Senate. He wore triumphal dress at all public functions. Divine imagery began surrounding him, with temples considered in his honor and public emphasis on his claimed descent from Venus through Aeneas. What all of this meant was simple. One man now held every major constitutional office simultaneously. The Senate was powerless to check him because he controlled Senate membership and could veto any decision. The popular assemblies rubber-stamped whatever he proposed. The military was loyal to him personally rather than to Rome or its institutions. He controlled all major appointments to offices and provincial commands. He controlled the treasury. He controlled foreign policy. The Republic existed in name only. The institutions still functioned on the surface, but Caesar's will was the only thing that actually mattered. Despite his autocratic power, Caesar implemented reforms that would outlast him and influence Western civilization for centuries. His calendar reform created the Julian calendar with a 365.25-day year that fixed the massive drift that had accumulated in the old Roman calendar. The Julian calendar remained the standard in the Western world for over 1,600 years until the Gregorian modifications in 1582, and it's still the basis for our modern calendar system. Caesar passed debt relief legislation that helped struggling citizens, capped interest rates to prevent usurious lending, and forgave rent that who had accumulated during the chaos of the Civil War. He distributed land to more than 80,000 veterans and poor citizens and established colonies throughout the empire where these people could build new lives. He expanded the Senate from 600 to 900 members, which diluted the power of the old aristocracy and included men from the provinces and lower social classes. Critics mockingly referred to Gallic senators, but Caesar's expansion made the Senate more representative of the empire's diversity. He extended Roman citizenship to Cisalpine Gaul, bringing more people into the Roman political system. He reformed provincial administration to reduce corruption and implemented massive public building programs that provided employment for the urban masses. Caesar was also planning enormous military campaigns. He intended to launch expeditions against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat at Carrhae and against Dacia in what is now Romania. These campaigns were scheduled to begin in March 44 BC. And they would have taken Caesar away from Rome for years. In February 44 BC, during the Lupercalia festival, Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem while the crowd watched. Caesar refused it, though sources disagree about whether his refusal seemed genuine or reluctant. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered the refusal, others seemed disappointed. The question everyone asked was whether this had been staged as a way to test public opinion about Caesar becoming king. Caesar had all the power of a king, but he lacked the title and the formal legitimacy that came with it. Some senators believed that Caesar would soon demand to be made king officially. Rumors circulated that the Sibylline books, which were ancient prophetic texts consulted during crises, contained a prophecy that only a king could conquer Parthia. With Caesar's Parthian expedition scheduled to depart in March of 44 BC, fear grew that Caesar would use this prophecy as justification to crown himself king before leaving Rome. A group of approximately 60 senators formed a conspiracy to assassinate Caesar. The leaders included Marcus Junius Brutus, who was Caesar's close friend, and possibly his illegitimate son, and who was descended from the ancient Brutus who had expelled Rome's last king. Gaius Cassius Longinus had been a Pompeian who received Caesar's pardon but remained resentful of Caesar's power. Decimus Brutus Albinus was one of Caesar's most trusted generals who nevertheless joined the conspiracy. The conspirators' motivations varied widely. Some genuinely believed they were defending the Republic and that killing Caesar would restore constitutional government. Some harbored personal resentment despite having received Caesar's clemency. Some feared that Caesar would eventually turn on them and that accepting his mercy now meant execution later. They called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, and rationalized that killing Caesar would save the Republic. On March 15, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar arrived at Pompey's theater complex where the Senate was meeting. Sources claim there were omens and warnings. His wife Calpurnia had nightmares and begged him not to go. A soothsayer warned him to beware the Ides of March. Animal sacrifices showed unfavorable signs. Caesar dismissed all of these warnings and attended the Senate meeting. The conspirators surrounded Caesar under the pretense of presenting a petition. Tullius Cimber approached with his petition and grabbed Caesar's toga, pulling it from his shoulder. This was the signal. Casca struck first, stabbing Caesar in the neck or shoulder. Caesar fought back, stabbing Casca's arm with his stylus, the pointed instrument used for writing on wax tablets. The other conspirators closed in. Caesar received 23 stab wounds as the senators attacked him from all sides. When Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he allegedly spoke his last words. Sources disagree about what he said. Some claim et tu, Brute, in Latin. Others report kai su, teknon, in Greek meaning you too, child, while others suggest he said nothing at all. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, dying at the feet of the enemy he had defeated 6 years earlier. The conspirators fled, leaving Caesar's body bleeding on the Senate floor. Mark Antony, who was Caesar's co-consul, escaped the theater, unsure whether he was also a target. Rome descended into immediate chaos. Caesar died at age 55. He had ruled Rome absolutely for approximately 5 years, holding supreme power from the crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC to his assassination in 44 BC. His total political career spanned 40 years from his first office as quaestor in 69 BC to his death. He had conquered Gaul in 8 years of warfare that killed an estimated 1 million people and doubled Rome's territory. He had won a civil war against forces that outnumbered him. He had destroyed the republican system that had governed Rome for 482 years. He had implemented reforms in the calendar, legal structures, and administrative systems that would influence Western civilization for millennia. He had created the template for imperial rule that his successors would follow. His very name became synonymous with absolute power. Caesar became Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, and Gazar in other Slavic languages. July is still named after him more than 2,000 years after his death. The conspirators believed that killing Caesar would restore the Republic. They were catastrophically wrong. Caesar's assassination triggered another 13 years of civil war. Caesar's adopted heir, his grandnephew Octavian, who would later take the name Augustus, defeated all rivals including Mark Antony, and became Rome's first emperor. The Republic never returned. Caesar had destroyed it so thoroughly that even his death couldn't resurrect it. The institutions he had hollowed out remained hollow. The precedents he had set, that military force trumped constitutional authority, that popular support could override legal restrictions, that one man with enough ambition and enough legions could dominate the entire Roman state, those precedents couldn't be erased. Julius Caesar had transformed the Roman Republic into the foundation of the Roman Empire, and no amount of blood spilled in the Senate that March day could undo what he had accomplished. This is the complete story of Julius Caesar's rise from birth in 100 BC to dictatorship and assassination in 44 BC. What do you think? Was Caesar a hero or a villain, savior or destroyer? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for watching.